Cuba is doing very well. It's inoculating its citizens of 11 million people. And it's also sending teams down to Latin America to help out in Latin America. So it's no surprise, since Cuba has over the years concentrated on strengthening its medical program. It's rather famous for having itinerant doctors that travel all over the world helping people in different places. And so they're doing very well with their own COVID-19 preparations and inoculations and so forth and so on. No real surprise there. Okay, today I'm going to give a meandering presentation, yet another one. I'm sorry I have the snivels. I don't know what it is. I hope it isn't Rona. I've already got my shots, but I don't know if that matters. I really don't. Well, one tries to keep up with the news. I'm sure some of you at least are keeping up with the news and different announcements and so forth. And I think people your age will be inoculated by the late spring or early summer. I hope so. Those of you that care to. There's a huge issue with vaccination. Thank God the country vaccinated for polio. My mother had polio. People got polio, people still get polio, but it's a terrible disease. You'd go to a swimming pool and then a few weeks later you couldn't walk, maybe for the rest of your life. And they vaccinated Americans, almost everybody, for polio. I don't remember reading or hearing about anti-vaxxers when it came to polio. You could see with your eyes the results, people walking around, people in wheelchairs, or they even had to put people in iron lungs who couldn't really breathe on their own. And so I don't remember the same with measles, mumps. I know some of the issues involved. There's this, I'm not going to go on all the issues. I know some of them, but we're dealing with a new world with the internet and all the different forces of misinformation that are out there, and from all sides, really. We're in a wild west when it comes to truth. It's the fastest gunslinger that comes into town, who's the new hero for 30 minutes until the next fast gunslinger comes in and shoots him. So it's one truth eliminating the next truth over and over again. And all you have to do is keep your ears open and try to find your reputable sources of information and try to adhere to what you think is rationality. But there are critics of this whole debate on the left and the right. It's the middle that seems to be in the crunch. The left and the right have issues, and the moderate left, the moderate right are a little more honed towards the center, but not the center. The center isn't that great either, but we all have to now drill down and do our own spelunking. We can't just be passive consumers of news. We have to do our own research and talk to friends and rationally try to come to some decision about what to do, when to do it, et cetera, et cetera. Thank God for the warm weather. Very comfortable. Lovely. So anyway, today I was going to do some remarks. This is from an older talk. I haven't practiced it in a long time, so it's going to be a little speculative and off the cuff, just sort of how I like to do things. At this point in the semester, a lot of you are burned out between the stress of current events and the stress of schoolwork and everything else is stress of isolation in some cases, displacement, etc. We're all suffering from stress. Now, I do recommend, as much as I said, keep track with the news and keep track of the news, I put myself on news hiatus. I think for the last week or so, I've just not listened. I look at the news for a minute, but I don't obsess about it. I listen to books on tape. I listen to old radio shows on YouTube. I've seen every B movie from Britain in the 50s. That's an acquired taste. But I love the British accent. I love London in the early 50s was quite funky. They hadn't really rebuilt from World War II, so half the streets are bombed out, and the crooks have plenty of places to hide in the rubble. And the kids are chasing around, and you have these dicey clubs doing dicey things. British film in the 50s. Wow. Really working class films. These were not for the hoi polloi. I mean, these were not for the aristocrats. These were for the working man. And I guess they went to the movies. It was before TV became popular over there. I love them because they don't require too much thought on my part. I can just passively watch, look, listen. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen. And also, I'll try to look at my speaker today. If anybody wants to say anything, I'll try to make sure my speaker is working, so I don't get distressed about nobody talking when in fact it's my speaker that's not talking. So we're going to try this out here. Oh, before I start, are there still any presentations that have yet to be made? I think we're all caught up, so I'll begin. This show ends up with the British artist Francis Bacon, but it begins in a somewhat preambulatory way. What's preambulatory mean? It means kind of walking around instead of going in a straight line. And so the tentative title is Matter and Spirit. Two nebulous terms. People debate what matter actually is. That stuff that you hit your knee against, that side of the table. I think if you want to define matter as anything, it equates to pain and sometimes pleasure. If you're enjoying your ice cream cone, you're pleasantly intermixing with matter. It's stuff, it's a mineral, it's substance. It has a concept, it has a form. The concept is the ice cream cone. The form is the cone, the knobby thing on top. And the material is just the stuff you're holding in your hand that you don't want to drop and let it, crash on the ground, make a big mess. Spirit, from my recent research, philosophically means, and I'm paraphrasing here and I'm simplifying, spirit would be all of our collective minds on this planet. All human minds on this planet altogether constitute in the now, in this very instant, right now, spirit. Now you could be more or less constrictivist and constrict that to human beings, or you could include animals, your dog, your cat, because they seem to be semi-conscious. They're happy when you come home. I had a dog. He had dreams. That's enough for me. If my dog is there racing on the bed, kicking his legs, breathing quickly, he's dreaming. He's dreaming of either the joy of chasing a rabbit or he's running away from a bear. But at any rate, that's spirit enough for me. And then those of you that are more spiritually inclined, you'd include otherworldly spirits, superhuman spirits. Maybe there are aliens out there that are intermingling with us. So that is the definition of spirit. So from chaos to order. In the beginning, we have the dimensionless dot in the universe. It's called the Big Bang Theory. And if you read your physics, people that write about the Big Bang, they theorize that there was a dimensionless point in space of immeasurable mass, meaning it was immeasurably heavy, and in their conceptualization, virtually dimensionless, which is impossible to think about or compute. But the expansion of the universe happened in millionths of a second. So there are a lot of books about the Big Bang, and you can read about it, and it doesn't really completely conflict with other religious ideas, Christianity, Hinduism, or any other world religions, perhaps, in that a lot of religions have this idea of this originary moment where everything explodes from the center. And then theorists like Stephen Hawking would say that on the other side of this dot would be a black hole with a previous universe. And that would conspire with the Hindu idea that there's a universe, it expands, it contracts, it collapses, it explodes, it expands, it contracts, it collapses, it explodes, it on and on and on. So that would be a Hindu version of the cosmic history. And there are many, many non-religious commentaries about this that you can check. It's fascinating stuff. Go to a lecture sometime here at Penn State when we do lectures again, and listen to these guys. But anyway, this conforms to a very ancient Platonic or Pythagorean idea of the beginning of the universe. And then the point extends to a line because of some errancy, or the philosopher Plotinus calls it audacity, where the point out of curiosity or desire of self-knowledge extends, and then it extends to a plane. And the ancient Chaldeans, Julian, the pseudo-Chaldean, said, do not deepen the plane, because a lot of Neoplatonics and Chaldean seers saw the three-dimensionality as the place of matter and desire, and thus sin and evil. But we insist on deepening the plane. This could be the famous some of you know the name of the cube, the famous cube that either the dotted line is in the background or the dotted line is the foreground. Anybody know the name of that cube? It's an optical illusion. Either the dotted line is the foreground or the dotted line is in the background. Anybody know the name of that cube? I thought the architecture student might.
I don't remember.
Pardon?
I said I don't remember.
You
I think
studied
I
it.
knew at some point.
So did I. And then the circle is a hugely influential geometric metaphor for existence. The sphere, the circle. The expansion of the circle. Neoplatonists, who were important in Western philosophy, and they were a group of philosophers from the early Roman Empire, 200 AD. The expansion and contraction of the universe, in their mind, this progression going forward, and then a regression going back to the initial point of rest in the middle. And that was very influential in terms of their theorization of how the universe breathed. This would also conform to the idea of the inflation theory of the universe, that the universe keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Some people contend there'd be a contraction and it will come back, go back and become a kind of heat death. And then others contend that it will keep expanding and expanding until it becomes cold and dies in coldness. And so there's a camp on the one side of physicists that believe in the heat death, and a camp on the other side that believes in the death by freezing of the universe. And as I said before, and I'll say it again, when I came to Penn State and I met physicists, and they couldn't sleep at night because of this stuff. And I was worried about paying a bill at the end of the month. And they were worried about the heat death of the universe in 8 billion years. It was such a relief to meet these guys that were really worried about what was going to happen in 8 billion years. It was really a relief. It made my little problem seem, minuscule in comparison. So there you have it. My high-tech animation here. The expansion and collapse of the universe, and the Neoplatonic idea of progression, regression, and rest. Now I'm going on to the idea of petroglyphs now, doing some sort of really fundamental primitivist tour of human image making. And I don't know where this is. Let's see if I have it. Now, this could be on a rock anywhere in the world. Petroglyphs cover the planet from Australia to Ireland to Arizona to India. These scratchings on the rocks are everywhere. And here I should insert a song by the great Texan troubadour, Terry Allen, who was a great musician and artist, who did a wonderful song called Writing on the Rocks, about a guy out in the Southwest from Texas to Arizona that just goes out in his pickup truck on an endless tour, writing on the rocks. Maybe admonitions, maybe warnings, maybe empowerments. He's just writing on the rocks. It's a great song, Terry Allen. Talismans, going back to the most primitivistic form of image making and empowerment through images. Because the point would be that this is a talisman. This is an embossed coin. This is the inscription of a chant. The chant has miraculous powers. It will protect you from lightning. It will draw a lover towards you. It will bring you wealth. And so the inscription of this chant onto this token empowers the bearer. You were empowered by this. Now, as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, when there was still publishing and you could still get occult magazines at a newsstand at a bus stop, you'd find these magical magazines and you could send off for talisman. And I'm sure you can get them today, because the theory holds. And it's very important in India. Very important. I was there several times, and I have my magical formula. I have my talisman. Now with tattooing today, and so many people having tattoos, a lot of people are wearing tattoos on their body, talisman on their body, which is an interesting trend, a neo-primitivist trend. I was looking at pictures of spring break in Miami last week, and people were walking around virtually naked on the streets with tattoos all over their body. And that's neo-primitivism, because a good 19th century Victorian, well, some of the Victorians had secret tattoos, but to walk around virtually naked on the street with tattoos all over your body, that's considered barbaric and primitive to some people's opinion. And we're reversing history in a way as we go back to this idea of signature, getting a signature and some sort of incantation written on our body that we expose virtually naked. So it's a very interesting time in history today. This is a talisman. It has magical powers. Cosmograms. This is a Haitian cosmogram. The Haitians have an amazing syncretic religion. It's a mixture of Eastern African and Roman Catholic imagery, very complex theology, cosmology. Now, the idea of a cosmogram is this isn't for you to see. This cosmogram is for spirits to see, middle beings to see. The middle beings would be the beings that exist between the ground of our earth, below us, below our feet, and the heavens. The middle beings occupy that middle passage between earth and heaven. Some people call them angels, some people call them demons. The Haitians call them Loa. And so these insignias are written and dedicated to them. Now, some of these insignia were created by brilliant proto-scientific minds in Italy, such as Giordano Bruno in the height of the Renaissance was creating insignia like this, because he thought that these kinds of insignia, proper use of symbols, could affect the will of the planets. Look up Giordano Bruno. He was one of the first Western scholars who believed that the earth revolved around the sun when it was still apostasy and heresy. And in fact, he was burned in a stake at the famous piazza in Rome that a lot of you, if you've been to Rome, you visited this piazza where they sell all the fruit. What do they call it? Anyway, they have a statue to Giordano Bruno at the entrance to this piazza. It's a famous piazza in downtown Rome where they have all the fruit sellers, vibrant place. And he was executed there in 1600 by the Vatican, of course, for being a heretic, for saying that the earth revolved around the sun. But at the same time, he believed in these kinds of insignia and the fact that they could maybe affect the heavens. So it was Renaissance was an amazing moment of a admixture of belief in hard science and also in these amazing mythological para-religious dimensions. Now, this is a contemporary artist, deceased sadly, and not quite contemporary. Jean-Michel Basquiat, an American Haitian whose career took place in New York and then around the world. He was world famous, very successful. Jean-Michel Basquiat, B-A-S-Q-U-I-A-T, Jean-Michel Basquiat, B-A-S-I-Q-U-I-A-T, a brilliant young artist who started out as a graffiti artist in the subways in the late 70s, early 80s, and then subsequently got gallery representation. And before you knew it, he was a world star. Very prolific. Art scholars were lecturing about his work while he was still alive, and he died at a very young age. I believe there's a movie about him you can see. David Bowie plays Warhol. And here you see the elements of the cosmogram, the pictograph, these insignia that are implanted in this image, these pseudo-diagrammatic efficacies. And some of you might have done these as kids. I used to make pseudo equations. I didn't know what an equation meant, but I'd write up my own. They were just pseudo equations, pseudo diagrams, pseudo scientific diagrams, like you'd see in a science fiction movie or something. And so there's this compilation, this compulsion to diagrammatize, to schematize, to reduce things to the second dimension in order to schematize things. So here we're not deepening the plane. We're making the plane more shallow, if you remember what I commented on at the beginning of the lecture. As everything's flattened out to provide a clear map of this pseudo-psychology of this, whatever this beast is, this friendly beast. I think of him as rather friendly. With all the working in his brain, it's a neuron scientific diagram in his brain. What a great image. Okay, the artist today, and some of you don't know who Francis Bacon is. And I said a few classes ago with one of my classes, some of you have had too many Francis Bacon lectures. And some of you don't know who he is. So we'll just cut to the middle and Those of you that know who he is and are sick of him will just have to bear with me. This was a British artist. He was primarily known for his work just after World War II, 1945. He lived into his 80s. And so he was painting until through the early 1980s. And he was at one point considered the most important artist in the world, the most important painter in the world. He was gay. He was outside of the mainstream in some respects, although his works were worth millions of dollars even while he was alive. But he was basically a denizen of Soho and Piccadilly and inner London, and frequented dives and gambling halls, and apparently was generous to a fault and gave a lot of his money away to his different friends and companions. So here we see a lot of the elements I've been talking about. You see this strange, scrawny bird in the foreground, almost a cadaver of a bird, leaping out of this cubic dimension that we saw early in the talk today. One of the legs extends to a pseudo shadow or a black hole. Then we have the man who might or might not have a tourniquet and a hypo in his arm. It's not clear in this picture, but there are plenty of other pictures where we see people with hypos in their arm. We see a diagrammatization of the head. We see the throat. Probably could see the tonsils if we could look close enough. These are oil paintings on canvas, on linen. He did not prime his canvas, his linen, which normally you're not supposed to do because it rots the linen, but he encased all his paintings, these huge paintings, in glass. So they're protected from oxygenation. And in the back, we see some sort of an enigmatic figure, maybe a bullfighter in an arena, perhaps, because we have in the back, we see this curvilinear architecture, which is so interesting. Even the mirror or the door is curvilinear. To quote the philosopher Spinoza, what is the body? No one has yet determined what the body can do. Well, I guess we'll be able to say that again for another 1,000 years as our body evolves. And Spinoza was a philosopher from the early 1600s. But what a preconception of what the subject entailed, that the body could today, through our technologies, can do things that people 1,000 years ago could never have dreamed. So the body is in progress. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, what is needed now is simply to believe in the body. Well, that's enigmatic in its meaning, but it also has to do with the fact that as we are overcome by technology and more of our tasks are taken over by technology, we will have to believe in our bodies, in their inner truth, perhaps, since they're so crisscrossed by media and states of mind that are produced by technology and media, that we barely know what our body is to some extent. And so that's really what Bacon's work is about. It's about the issue of embodiment. This is an early, and should I say, enfleshment because the body is partly made of flesh. The body's partly spirit, it's partly flesh. And that is the struggle between the body and flesh. Anyway, this is from 1945, 46. Bacon was a vehement atheist, but his work is permeated by the issues related to the struggles, the sorrows of suffering. Why would an atheist care about suffering other than his own? So I've talked earlier in the semester about sacrifice. And what I meant by that was we have to put ourselves in the game. We can't hide. Part of us loves running out and joining the throng. And part of us wants to hide. In joining the throng, anything can happen. We sacrifice our safety to join the throng. This is an early image of sacrifice. The god Mithras, who was the god of the Roman legion in a late Hellenic period, sacrificing a bull. Here's one of my renditions of Zeus. The silly Zeus is the Greek god, is a bull. There was if you watch the program on HBO Rome, there's a scene in the program where they do a Terabulum. A rich Roman could have an ox sacrificed above them. The ox would have a sword thrust through its heart, and the disgorgement of blood would cover the celebrant in the ox blood. And this was apparently some sort of incredibly empowering experience for the wealthy celebrant. I don't know how many bullfights are still taking place, but as of the time of Ernest Hemingway and rather recently, I can't tell you how many bullfights are taking place today. I think Spain is there are legal bullfights where the bull is not killed, but historically the bull was killed in the ring up through at least the 1980s or longer, or maybe today. And so this idea of animal sacrifice goes back for eons and eons, and the bull being a symbol of masculinity, of strength, of power. We're afraid of the bull. And to master the bull, and plenty of matadors were killed in the process of doing this. So going on with the idea of sacrifice and the Christian theme, this suffering of the human body there's a debate about whether you can regionalize these images, but in Germany, the flesh was seen as excoriated, as tormented, as blistered, as bruised. So a crucifixion scene seen in Italy at the same time was idealized, and the body was oftentimes rather perfect looking. And in Germany, it was excoriated and pummeled and distressed. And look at the hands. But I want to re-emphasize from the beginning that this idea of sacrifice goes back to our own inner dimension of struggle as human subjects between the outer and the inner. We exist in an inner world and we exist in an outer world. And the sacrifice of the struggle has to do with this constant vying between the influence of the inner world and the influence of the outer world. That's why these images are meaningful to us and move us, if at all. So this is a later rendition of the cross by Rubens. Rubens is generally criticized for overemphasizing enfleshment, of making everything too fleshly, too palpable, too real. There's no place for idealization here. It's like being in a sweaty gym class or a sweaty yoga studio or a sweaty subway car. But maybe that's his genius at the same time. This uncomfortable impingement upon our own immaculate, pristine body by all these other bodies. So that could be both his demerit and also his strengths. The body in history of art has many tropes and many dimensions of articulation. And one trope that fascinates me is the reclining body thrown upright. Now, just in terms of thrownness, and I mentioned gravity a couple of weeks ago, and it doesn't really follow. I'll get back to the thrown body upright in a minute, but first of all, we have this epic picture by Memling, the Judgement, Last Judgment. The saved and the damned. Well, in this case, we see that the saved are all upright. They're perfectly comported. And then in the middle panel, we see this sad dividing out of the saved from the damned. Look at the micro narratives in this painting, as some people are turning around to see what's happening on the other side, and some aren't. Very interesting narrative here. And then on the other side, the damned they don't need to turn around and look. They're just trying to avoid their fate. And then in the torments of hell, we see the flailing bodies. I was always fascinated that the flailing, upturned bodies, the bodies thrown hither and thither, there's a certain kind of freedom there. The upright saved have to keep their pastoral comportment almost in a military fashion. No slumping. Watch that posture. You can see the proctor there on the panel. Maybe he's telling the guy, you're slumping. Don't slump. Whereas in the hell panel, the people are flailing around like they were in a punk club in the mosh pit. And so in a way, there's a kind of freedom in hell that heaven doesn't afford. So that's a very contrarian reading of this painting. But I've been doing this contrarian painting, reading for maybe 40 or 50 years as I've analyzed these images. So that's just my thing. Getting back to Bacon, this image from 1973, he showed in a gallery in New York called the Marlborough Gallery, and I was happy enough to see about 5 consecutive shows of his work over the years. And really, I maybe have seen a couple of museum retrospectives, but there was nothing like seeing every 2 or 3 years a new body of work fresh from the studio arriving in Marlborough, New York. And I just happened to be there to see the fresh work. What an experience. What an experience. There are a couple of movies about Francis Bacon you could look up. I haven't seen them. The great actor Derek Jacobi plays Francis Bacon in one of them. He looks like Francis Bacon. I really should see it. Francis Bacon was quite a character. His father was a horse trader. They were Anglo-Irish, so I suppose that means that they were Irish Protestants. And he was born either in Ireland or he might have been born in Ireland and spent some time in Britain. But in his early 20s, he was in Monte Carlo as a interior decorator. And I won't say more, just a boy in the crowd. And then got back to England in 1945 and started painting these paintings. And these tragic, sad, amazing paintings. Look at the colors. Again, this kind of arena is taking place here. You could say there is an ambivalence about human being. Perhaps there is a hatred of human beings, stifled aspirations, our mendacity, our cheap, infantile desires. And on the other hand, there might be, in terms of ambivalence, a great empathy and fellow feeling and heartfelt grief at the pain that we feel. And this would all be reflected through Francis Bacon's own self-consciousness, which was rent by the same sufferings that the rest of us feel. Sexuality had some sort of rather immense grasp on Bacon. He was gay, of course, and at the time in Britain, homosexual acts up until 1968 were illegal, could ruin one's career, could land one in jail. I guess the most famous trial in Britain having to do with these subjects was the trial of Oscar Wilde, the writer of the great Dorian Gray, Picture of Dorian Gray, which I should assign as a book for the class. But that ruined Orson Welles. Ruined that writer's life. And so the savagery of the passion and the sex act is here enunciated. There are some great images of meat in Western painting. There's the Rembrandt picture of a slab of meat that you might Google. And then there is a great painting by Yam Soutine, the great French Jewish artist of the early 20th century, Soutine, Soutin, who did an amazing slab of beef. And then there's the film from around the same time, Paris, 1929, by Franjou, Franju, Franjou, on the abattoir, or the slaughterhouse. So if you go to IMBD and look up Franjou, you'll find the title for that film, the famous film of the abattoir in Paris in 1929. Can't remember the name at the moment. A typical picture from the 60s. I must say, since he'd been a interior decorator in the 20s and 30s, some of his furniture has a rather swank looking quality to them. This is an image by Edward Muybridge, the Philadelphia photographer and researcher, very famously making encyclopedias of human motion in the 1870s and 80s. And so this is a wrestling scene shot by Edward Muybridge in Philadelphia sometime in the 70s or 80s, 1870s, 1880s. And these were hugely influential in Bacon's oeuvre. This is some of my theorization. I can just pass over, but briefly, I theorize in my various writings that the body and the flesh are sort of antagonistic. The body is what's on your driver's license, what stands in line. The flesh is what eats, what shits, what has sex. The flesh is kind of anti-labor, anti-control to a certain extent. It just wants to hang out, lounge in the sun. Although sometimes work can be, physical labor can be enjoyable in itself, up to a point. G. Deleuze, the philosopher, wrote a book called The Logic of Sensation about the work of Francis Bacon. Deleuze was a philosopher who was hugely influential in the late 60s, early 70s. He was one of what they called the philosophers of desire. And they were sort of rewriting Western metaphysics. And he described the characters in Deleuze's work as a cohort of performers who performed a kind of derisive athleticism. And in other words, a mocking athleticism. Imagine an Olympics of mockery, where a band of runners mocked running. One can only imagine. These are amazing paintings. Look at the ear, the deftness of this ear as a landmark on that fuzzy semi-bald head. The talk today has to do with a certain extremity of human experience. At my age, I'm not extolling these perimeters. I'm frightened by them. But I acknowledge them as parameters within which we work and live. So as horrific as these images might be, and pessimistic, they provide a particular point of no return, or a point, an absolute of a sort, a beyond which we don't want to go beyond. Art has a moral duty to map out the perimeters, and has. And as art devolves into entertainment and trite decorative follies, it loses sight of its moral integrity. And here we see someone who, through just the trick of history and time and being in the right place at the right time, was allowed to enunciate these dilemmas. It's an opposing figure. The painter Francis Bacon. If you go to Dublin, you'll see that his studio has been recreated in the museum in Dublin. Everything that was in London, off Piccadilly Square, wherever it was, has been uplifted and transplanted into this display of his studio in Dublin. You can look through a peephole and see exactly how it was. His studio was filthy. He was a drinker. He'd gamble. He'd hang out in the bar. He'd hang out with his friends. He'd come and paint into the early morning in his filthy studio. And he lived to be in his early 80s. So eat your vitamins, kids. But at any rate, fascinating character, very bright, very intellectual. There are dozens of interviews with him on his summation of his thinking about art and existence. This is an early picture by the very famous, very popular British painter, Lucian Freud, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. So if you don't know the work of Lucian Freud, you might check him out. Freud, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. But at any rate, this is a portrait from the early 50s of Freud's friend, Francis Bacon. Now, Freud's painting completely transcended this particular period, but these are great paintings. But if you look at his later work from the 60s and 70s and 80s, you'll see that he transcended this in a remarkable way. But it's a very touching portrait of Francis Bacon. This is one of Bacon's portraits. Questioning what is the face in relationship to identity? The face is the ultimate mask. The most welcoming face can hide the most pernicious intent. We're taught in life to not trust a face. On the other hand, we have to trust faces. Faces are the picture to the soul. The initial face is our mother's face. As an infant, you look at your mother's face and there's only trust and love. And that's the imprint of the human face on the human condition. That initial face you look up to in infancy, who's all giving, all caring, the mother's face. So we're imprinted with this idea that I'll trust a face when I like it, but then you run across the faces that are the face of the liar or the conspirator. And I think this painting relates to the ambiguity and to the ambivalence Bacon felt regarding faces and its relationship to identity and intentionality. Now, I mentioned this the other day. I was talking about self-consciousness and the idea of rending. The rending of self-consciousness, the idea that self-consciousness is both an understanding of the I'm here and also the idea of you see me. So I'm here is completely integrated in a way. But the idea that you see me completely off balances that certainty. Because your gaze objectifies me. And then if you're not even in the room and I'm looking in a mirror, I might experience this bifurcation of flesh and form. I feel I know who I am, but who am I? My estimation of myself and who I objectively am are two different things. This is a portrait of Bacon's lover, George Dreyer, 1967. And he seems to be looking in some mirror or television device. It's not clear what it is. But Dreyer's own face seems to be dissolving or diminishing in a way, of a huge ear. You can see a place where an eye might be. And then a huge schematic tear. A schematic tear. And he's peering at this representation of himself and whatever this device is, a mirror. Today could easily be a laptop. And his face is much more it's
Battery medium.
his face is much more articulated and defined, except it's being split in half by this blue void. A blue void is dividing his face rather surgically. You see one side of the eye and the other side of the eye, and it's like they're surgically removed from one another. This is a flaying. This is a rending of this face that we're all faced with, our faces, which we love and we question. And poor George here in this beautiful suit that he's wearing, this convoluted maelstrom of a suit. It almost looks like an ocean by William Turner or something. It's a suit that is just ripped asunder by perturbation, the perturbation waves of embodiment, restlessness, with that jutting foreleg and that wonderfully articulated sole of the shoe. So Bacon has these moments of complete disarticulation and dissolution, where everything's falling apart, and other points of concretion, where the sole of a shoe is entirely factual and there, indisputable, a fact. Put that on your driver's license. George Dreyer, Bacon's lover, sadly committed suicide some years later for whatever reason. Another picture of George Dreyer. I miss men's suits. Men used to wear suits. Everybody wore a suit and tie. Bums wore suits. Crooks wore suits. Businessmen wore suits. Every guy wore a suit. It was a wonderful uniform, which you'll see if you look at film noir or whatnot. Now, this is an earlier painting by Francis Bacon, much earlier, from the early 50s. He loved the history of art. And so this is a rendition of one of the popes, painted by maybe Titian or Velázquez or some sort of amalgam of the two. Some of his were specifically painted by Titian or Velázquez, but the Pope is a symbol of male authority, patriarchy, et cetera, et cetera. Certainty. We look to the Pope for certainty, for the imprimatur, for the ultimate truth. The Pope will give us the ultimate truth. And in this case, the Pope is screaming. So this middle image here is the entrance to Bacon's studio. So if you go to Dublin, you'll see that staircase, that very staircase in the door leading up to Bacon's studio. So that is his studio. And then we see this kind of track, this arena, this track with the different physical events on the track. It's interesting, on the left, we seem to have a figure that's semi-dressed, semi-nude, or just in the process of undressing, perhaps. And again, we see the portrait of Dreier on the right. And then in the middle, again, we see this odd arm going and unlocking the door with this key. So he had a lot of nomenclature and incidents of depiction of quotidian objects or objects of the everyday. The railing of a staircase, the drawstring of a lamp, the naked light bulb figures in, obviously. And these odd colors, this pale fuchsia, if I may say. So I think in terms of what Bacon has accomplished, he's the ultimate oil painter who took oil painting to its epitome. Oil painting will go on. People didn't like these at the time. People will learn to dislike these as they go on, or denigrate the artist. And you have everything having to do with class and with wealth and with the whole, all the issues related to the luxuriant object. But our history provided with us in my lifetime with this demonstration of this investment of research, non-linguistically. This wasn't a sociology report. This wasn't a report to the government. These were paintings. Here's your cursor prior to computers. My cursor is circling this cursor, which is prior to the computers. This guy is on a toilet doing his thing. Here's another one of these ambiguous shadows where the human seems to be casting a bat shadow. This guy seems to be launching his lunch into a sink. These are huge. This could be 13 feet across. This is another one of these primitive, embryonic bird monsters lost in this huge shadow. And this structure, the schematic event horizon of where they, it's like a cage. It's a hypothetical cage. He's quoting himself here in a way. There's an amazing article in Art International. Maybe it's online. I don't know. I have a copy of it. Bacon and radiology. He studied X-rays, radiology. He studied X-rays and got a lot of inspiration from X-rays. And there's an interesting article on Bacon and radiology. And here's another kind of close-up of this horrible protoplasmic human bird here, where the leg and the feet seem to be turning into fleshly pseudo shadows within this structure. Bacon, as I recall, liked to say that paint is flesh. So that was his ideology. Of course, we saw a triptych earlier in a Memling picture of the Last Judgment. So he took up this idea of the triptych as some sort of reclamation of this form as an authoritative enunciation of the epic scale before, during, and after, however you want to read it. Yes, no, maybe. This is a great late picture by Bacon. He never lost his skills up to the very end, even into his 80s. He was a deft manipulator of the brush. Here we have this bizarre sphinx looking on as this guy is tending to his broken leg, his distressed bandages, and looks like he was shot. And in the back, we see another one of these bizarre schematic protoplasmic creatures. This would be a rather famous picture from '64 or something of two men in a bed together. And finally, we have these images of force, of just dynamicism, of the force of expulsion of water from a pipe. I don't think our modern commentary or narrative relates enough to the idea of sheer force. I lived in New Orleans at one point, and then in 2005, when the flood hit New Orleans and the hurricane, this ineluctable force of water erasing a city. Look it up. Look it up. A major American city was virtually erased by the force of this eruption of water, this dynamism of physical force. So you could be hit by a bus, you could be hit by lightning. There are different reasons why you might suffer your demise through different aspects of natural force. But it's an amazing conceptual realm to inhabit for a moment. Force, this upsurge, this discharge, this explosive dimension of power. And in this case, it looks like bad plumbing. This just looks like bad plumbing. So Bacon did a painting about bad plumbing, which could happen to anybody. There seems to be an eyeball over here. The red arrow is checking out an eyeball there in the corner. But basically, it looks like just the horror of bad plumbing. This is an earlier picture from the 50s, early 50s, perhaps a man in a shower. And this is the end of the talk. And I will end screen sharing if I can. If I can. So I hope some of you are still with me. I've recorded this talk. Some of you knew Bacon's work, some of you didn't. It's obviously something I've thought about for many years. It relates the power of paint to express emotion and complex ideas. And you'll each pursue your own path. But I admire people who stick to a kind of integrity or a bond with the material. To see what it's capable of expressing. Because Bacon provided a plethora of ideas non-linguistically. And we go back to the beginning of the talk, petroglyphs, cosmograms, talisman, communication of thought through pictures. And I'm not smart enough to completely understand the intricacies of that idea. But I think it's really one reason that the art school exists. To extol the idea that we can communicate non-linguistically through pictures, through images, in a profound and important way. Now, does anybody have any questions or thoughts regarding anything that I discussed today? Had anybody studied Basquiat? Who I mentioned earlier? Maybe I'll do a class of Basquiat. I'm sure there are a lot of documentaries about Francis Bacon. There are a couple of fictional films about Francis Bacon. There's a Hollywood film about Basquiat. So we kind of figure into the popular culture in a certain way. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation today, this discussion. I'm sure it gave you some content. And look up any of these references as you will. And thank you for your attention today. I really appreciate those of you that are contacting me. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your personal interaction with me, so that it's not just, I'm just not talking to myself. And a lot of you are communicating with me. And though you might be hesitant to do it during class and a kind of a polemic like I produced today, it's hard for you to respond. But personally, you can get in touch with me and either talk about some content regarding the class or your work or whatever. But I really appreciate when I hear from you individually. And if I don't always answer promptly, I will endeavor to answer in time. So at this point, have a wonderful weekend. Food for thought for sure. Given what we've been through this last year, none of this should be too alien to you in terms of what we're all facing. But I hope that in this work, why is there cause for hope? Empathy, fellow feeling, love for the other, for the anonymous other, a feeling of solidarity with the suffering. That's the cause for hope. That's what will keep us going in the face of all our dilemmas. We will continue as a species because of our regard for each other. I'll leave it with that. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next week.